Today, we're taking a look at the Be Quiet PureLoop 2 FX ARGB CPU cooler. Be Quiet sent this over for a Be Quiet themed build and testing with my Ryzen 7 7700X gaming platform. The PureLoop 2 FX series of all-in-one water coolers come in 3 sizes in order to support most of the typical gaming builds. There's the 240mm version, the 280mm version, and the 360mm version for beefier CPUs and larger cases. The FX series of the PureLoop 2 water coolers all feature ARGB lighting elements in addition to the build quality and top-tier designs that we're used to seeing from Be Quiet. As for this PureLoop 2 FX 280mm cooler, I'll be going through the specs, the installation, some CPU system testing in general, as well as the build quality. The PureLoop 2 FX cooler will come either with 2 or 3 120 or 140mm Lightwings PWM fans, depending on the rad size you buy. On the 280mm unit that I have here today, I have 2 Lightwings fans that are 140mm each. Each of these fans pushes a maximum of 56 CFM at 1.49mm to H2O worth of static pressure at about 23 dBA. The series of Lightwings fans from Be Quiet are of course illuminated with the ARGB ring that you see around the edges of the fan blades. There are 20 LEDs in this light ring. These fans were designed to make sure that you weren't being annoyed by your CPU cooler during intense and long gaming sessions, and they definitely live up to that promise. As for the radiator on this water cooler, since it's the 280mm version, you're getting a good-sized 317mm long by 27mm thick radiator. A radiator this wide and this thick will really help soak up those high peak temperatures to keep the CPU nice and cool, especially while gaming. In terms of the pump, it can be run between 4,000 RPMs and a maximum of 5,500 RPMs. The fans do have standard 3-pin RGB connections, as well as 4-pin PWM power and signal connections. The pump uses a 4-pin PWM connector for power and signal as well. The tubing length on the PureLoop 2 FX series of water coolers is 400mm, which is quite nice because it's definitely going to give you enough room to position the radiator pretty much wherever you need to inside of your case. As for the overall sound level of the water cooler, we're looking at about 10.8 dBA at 25% fan speed, 22.4 dBA at about 50% fan speed, which in my opinion is really the sweet spot on this cooler with the Ryzen 7 7700X. And for the overclockers out there, 32.8 dBA at 100 RPM, which works out to roughly 1500 RPM on the fans and about 5500 RPM on the pump. Installation for the PureLoop 2 280mm cooler was relatively easy. I think most of the difficulty in installing liquid coolers comes from the power and RGB connections, as well as deciding where and how to mount the radiator. The case that I'll be testing with today is the Be Quiet PureBase 500 FX. Since the GPU I'll be testing with is a mid-range RTX 3060 Ti, I'll be installing the radiator in the front of the case. This will ensure that the radiator gets the freshest air coming into the case to cool the CPU as well as it can. Generally, when I install water coolers, I always mount the radiator first, and then I mount the pump block, or the block in this case, second. It just works out to be a little bit easier that way. I didn't have any issues with the mounting hardware included, so that was nice to see. Be Quiet notably puts the pump in line with the tubing a little bit closer to the radiator. It's not installed inside of what is traditionally the pump block combo unit. The piece that goes over the CPU in this case is really just a water block. It does have a little bit of adjustment there, and it is kind of a unique and interesting look. I thought this design was kind of cool because you still get the RGB pump block look of the block on top of the CPU, but then you can also see the pump housing inside of the case. The installation, at least on an AM5 platform, and by extension AM4, was relatively easy. Let's move on and take a look at the stress testing results. For the stress testing, the ambient temperature in the room will be about 20 degrees Celsius, or about 68 Fahrenheit. The CPU and the GPU were the Ryzen 7 7700X and the MSI RTX 3060 Ti Ventus X2. The system, like I said, was built inside of a Be Quiet PureBase 500 FX case. For the first test, I always like to run ASUS Realbench since this test loads up the CPU and the GPU at the same time, the same way, every time you run it. After 1 hour of testing, the CPU averaged 95C, while the clock speeds were about 5 to 5.1 GHz. The GPU core averaged about 68C as well. Since by default, the Ryzen CPUs in the 7000 series boost pretty much up until 95C, this result was actually expected and quite good. I was happy to see that it was hitting between 5 and 5.1 GHz across all of the cores simultaneously. Moving on to the AIO CPU testing, the 7700X averaged about 80C during the hour-long test. The last type of dedicated CPU testing that I do is Prime 95 smallest FFT. This test always generates an obscene amount of heat and uses tons of power. Most CPUs end up throttling. In this test, the Ryzen 7700X hit 95C, but it also had to clock down to about 4.8 to 4.9 GHz. This is generally what I would expect since the power usage and temperatures were so high. But as I said, this is pretty normal, and it is a good showing of the cooler cooling the CPU. In terms of gaming though, this larger 280mm radiator is definitely going to soak up those smaller, less frequent, and lower duration CPU temperature spikes, so it'll even out the temperature, making a stable clock speed for the CPU during gaming sessions. I ended up looping 3D Mark TimeSpy for about an hour and saw that the average CPU temperature across all of the cores and across all 3 tests was about 68C. The clock speeds were regularly over 5.2 GHz as well. Another neat feature of the PureLoop CPU coolers is that Be Quiet includes a mechanism for refilling your closed loop. Most manufacturers no longer include this, but Be Quiet typically does it with a screw or a thumb screw. Inside of each of the PureLoop CPU coolers, you'll be given an extra water bottle for topping off your cooler every 1 to 2 years. In terms of build quality, I would say the PureLoop 280 model that I have here is awesome. There were no issues with sharp edges anywhere, everything fit the way it was supposed to, and I didn't have any trouble understanding how to install or use the system. The cooler looks great when it's finally installed as well. I would definitely say that if you're looking for a solid CPU water cooler, keep in mind the PureLoop 2 FX series. I think the value is definitely here in terms of the looks, the performance, and the pricing. I definitely recommend the 280mm version if you're going to use it with a Ryzen 7700X CPU or better, any of the Ryzen 9s on the AMD side, or any of the i7s or i9s on the Intel side. If you do have support for a 360mm RAD, even better, but definitely make sure to confirm that with your case manufacturer specs. Until next time, enjoy your tech stuff.